Welcome back to Biology 206. I'm Dr. Jennifer Belzer, and today we're going to be talking about the physical environment. Okay, so why is the physical environment important? Well, when we think about where organisms live, they have a set of conditions that they can live within. So you can think of any environmental variable you're interested in. If we're thinking about a plant like this, maybe it's light, maybe it's nutrients, maybe it's water availability. For any organism, thinking about temperature. For animals, thinking about availability of some specific food resource, or they're very reliant on plants that rely on all the things we just listed. So you can think of any of your favorite environmental variables that are relevant, and you can think about those environmental variables from a low value to a high value. And for any species, the rate of their physiological process goes from low, so doing not very well, to high, so doing very, very well. So you can think of metabolism, you can think of photosynthesis, you can think of any physiological process that you want to imagine here. That's what you have on your y-axis. On your x-axis, you have an environmental variable. And so what we know is that for any single environmental variable, you've got conditions that promote low physiological function when that environmental variable is too low or too high. And then you get to conditions that are okay. So the organism may not be functioning at its prime, but it's going to be able to survive and do all right. And so that maybe is where its physiological function is kind of in between high and low. These are values that are okay for its survival. And then you have some peak conditions where its physiological rates are going to be the highest, where it's going to be performing best. And so within those kind of zones of environmental conditions that allow it to survive, and in some cases to thrive, this is sort of the degree of environmental variability that organism can tolerate. Okay, so when we think about environmental tolerance, we think about a curve like this for any single species. And then you can think about lots of different environmental variables, and when you bring all those different environmental variables together, you get the niche of that organism, and we'll be talking about niches moving forward. But I wanted to just remind you of why the physical environment is so very important when we're thinking about ecology. And this is what dictates the kinds of growth forms we have in different places. Do we have these kind of desert-like, succulent taxa? Are they species that are able to occur on this polygonal terrain and this tundra environment? Or are they species that are really well suited to this kind of rainforest environment? So we have all of these different sets of environmental conditions, and a species that does well up here isn't going to do well here or here, and the converse can be said as well. So we have these environmental conditions that lead to different assemblages of vegetation, and this is really critical to understand, because then that kind of dictates all of the other organisms that may be able to occur in those areas. Okay, so in today's lecture, and I'm just realizing this font is really small, so my apologies for that, but I'll read it out to you. In a nutshell, we want to understand the big global drivers of the physical environment. We're going to understand the difference between weather and climate. This is a really important one. These two terms often get conflated. We want to understand the processes that determine gradients of temperature and precipitation at the global and regional scales and across seasons. And then finally, we want to understand how temperature is determined by gains and losses of energy at the Earth's surface. And so these kind of big picture components of climate and the distribution of precipitation and temperature across the planet that again dictate where different organisms can live, the type of biome that we find in that location. And that'll lead us into the second set of lectures for this week, which is on the biosphere. Okay, so first of all, Weather does not equal climate. These are two very different things. They're certainly related, but they are really quite different. Okay, so weather is basically the conditions of the atmosphere over a short period of time. So when you go to your phone and you look at what is happening outside today, that is the weather. You are seeing the weather. We get weather forecasts that are sometimes good, sometimes bad, but they're sometimes good and they're sometimes bad because it can change within a matter of minutes or hours, and depending on where that storm moves, or all of these different factors that are really hard to predict. The weather from one area and the adjacent area can be really quite different. So I think of, if you think of a snowstorm in the winter, sometimes we'll hear, okay, we're going to get, maybe we get 5 centimeters of snow, but the adjacent town gets 20 or 30 centimeters of snow. And this is all just kind of this random variation in these weather conditions that change over small time frames and over small spatial areas as well. Okay. And climate is how the atmosphere behaves over a long period of time and space. So even though that neighboring town got 30 centimeters of snow and we got 5 centimeters of snow, our weather patterns were different for that day, but our climate would be described in the same way. So we probably, over the long term, that neighboring town probably has a pretty similar temperature, pretty similar precipitation, because it's close by. And so climate tends to be climate is pretty consistent over these fairly large areas of space and long periods of time. And it gives us the average regional weather pattern over decades. So it's at a much larger spatial resolution than is weather, and a much longer temporal resolution. So whereas with weather, maybe you get the fact that you're rainy on and having lightning on Saturday, but sunny on Sunday. In contrast, climate tells us, okay, well, what is the 30-year normal average temperature? So 30-year normal is the temperature averaged over 30 years for each of these months. And this would tell us the kind of climate we have, whether it's a season, we can tell that this is a seasonal climate. It gets much warmer in the summer than it is in the winter. Same thing for precipitation. So these are the differences between weather and climate. And so when we look at patterns of annual variation in temperatures, in precipitation, etc., these go up and down. And the average through those ups and downs is the climate. What we're seeing now with climate change is this consistent increasing trend. So you still have that variation around that trend line. And so sometimes we'll have a very cold winter, and you'll sometimes hear someone say, oh, well, it's so cold this winter, obviously we can't be experiencing climate change. But that's simply a low value in amongst a range of highs and lows that make up that average that as a whole is increasing through time, as we saw in our last lecture. Okay, so we know that climate controls where and how organisms live. So what determines climate? And this is a really important piece of that. And so again, this is taken from your textbook. And what we have is basically the energy balance of the planet. So you have incoming solar radiation. Some of that makes it through the atmosphere, and some of it doesn't. We have lots of incoming solar radiation that's reflected. So it just bounces off the atmosphere and goes back out to space. And that's about 30% of incoming solar radiation is reflected either by the clouds, so 23% reflected by the clouds and atmospheric gases, and then 9% reflected by the surface. So you think about Canada in the winter, it's a pretty white surface. So in the wintertime, the land surfaces in Canada and the water surfaces, because they freeze over and then have snow on them, they're very reflective. A lot of energy bounces back right from the surfaces, is not absorbed. In contrast, in the summer we have lots of nice dark forested surfaces, so those absorb a lot of energy. So we have some energy that's reflected by the surface, and that's determined by the property of the properties of the surface, and we'll get into that later in this lecture, or it's referred to as the albedo. So how reflective is that surface? Snow and ice is a very reflective surface. Dark green conifer forests are not very reflective. Okay, and then we have some energy that's absorbed by the atmosphere. About 20% of this is just taken up by the atmosphere and then re-emitted by the atmosphere. So you can see as long wave radiation, so it's absorbed, then re-emitted. So again, it never reaches the surface, but about 50% of the energy coming in from solar radiation reaches the surface and is absorbed. Okay, so when you have that energy that's absorbed, this is what warms the planet, and the amount of energy absorbed by the surface of the planet varies depending on where you are on the planet. And so not surprisingly, at the tropics, there's a lot more energy that comes in, and so you have a high amount of energy that warms that system and that is absorbed by that system. And in the north, especially this time of year where we have very little, short days, sun at very low angles, lots of reflective surfaces, we have much less energy absorbed by the surface. And so this varies by season, it varies by region as to what these numbers look like, but this is kind of an average value. Then we have energy that's lost from the planet by two different variables. One is sensible heat, and this is heat that's lost by convection processes, so wind moving along the surface and cooling the surface, and heat being lost that way. And the other is referred to as latent heat. This is evapotranspirative loss, so water that's lost, or heat that's lost during the evaporation process or during the transpiration process. So evaporation being open, being water evaporating from surfaces, transpiration being that active, stomatal opening, water moving out of those stomates from the plants and back to the atmosphere. So there's a fair amount of heat that is lost to the atmosphere through evapotranspirative processes. Okay, so these pieces sort of document or characterize the energy dynamics of solar radiation coming to the surface and being absorbed or reflected or re-radiated. But there's also this component of the interaction between energy being emitted from the surface, so all of these components, and energy that makes it back out to the atmosphere versus energy that's back radiated to the planet. And this is where the greenhouse effect that we always hear about comes into play. When we have an atmosphere that has more greenhouse gases in it, so water molecules, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, all of these, there's any number of greenhouse gases that basically help to trap heat at the Earth's surface, okay? So we have energy that's emitted from the surface of the planet, and then some of it makes it back out through the atmosphere. Some of it bounces back down and is absorbed by the surface again. And this is really important. This atmosphere and this back radiation is part of what makes this planet habitable, right? That atmosphere keeps the planet warm, it keeps energy in, and has made living on the planet possible. But when we have too many greenhouse gases, as we're seeing happening now with this rapid increase in fossil fuel use and associated greenhouse gas emissions, we end up with the problem that too much heat is trapped and the planet starts to warm up. Okay, so this is what we are facing with increases in greenhouse gas emissions and associated planetary warming. Okay, so, and you can see how fast this is happening. This is me when I was little, wearing my dad's hat and gloves. I was born, I'm going to tell you, in 1977 at 333 parts per million. That's a long way from where we are now at well over 400 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay, so in my lifetime, we've seen a really tremendous increase in carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere, which has directly modified how much of this outgoing energy is re-radiated toward or back radiated toward the planet. Okay, so what we're going to get into now is the fact that climate conditions are determined by atmospheric and ocean circulation. Okay, so this is a general picture of temperature and precipitation on the planet. And you can see, this is not a surprise to any of you, we have this nice warm band through the tropical regions. Here we have the equator. The hottest temperatures are right in around the equator, and then you get cooler and cooler as you move further north and south toward the poles. Okay, and here's our temperature gradient, with the dark reds being 30 degrees Celsius, the whites and purples, light purples being around minus 50 degrees Celsius. So tremendous variation in temperature across the planet. And obviously that variation varies by season, but these are average values. Okay, and here we have the same information, but for precipitation. This is annual average precipitation, with dark colors being, you know, upward of 2.5 meters of precipitation, and very light colors being next to no precipitation. So this is in centimeters. And so we can see that, you know, again, around these tropical regions, not surprisingly, we have a lot of precipitation, and we'll get into why that's the case. Then you have these bands of much less precipitation just north of the tropics, and then we get to areas with higher precipitation again throughout these temperate regions, and then that dwindles as you move to the poles. And I'm going to be telling you exactly why that is the case in the coming slides. Okay, so of course, why we see that gradient of very warm temperatures near the equator and cooler temperatures toward the poles is the fact that the sun heats the surface most intensely and consistently at the equator. So there's more energy at lower latitudes. And so when we think about how light hits the surface of the earth, and this is a great time of year to be talking about this, because we're at some of our shortest days during the year here in the northern hemisphere, and light is hitting the earth at very low angles. So we're getting these very weak. The sunlight at this time of year is incredibly weak, whereas at the equator or near the equator, it basically hits the surface of the earth in a perpendicular way, whereas it's really the same radiation is spread out over much larger areas when you get toward the poles. Okay, so, and again, this is something we're very, very accustomed to. We have a tilt on the planet of 23.5 degrees, and so we have our two solstices. We're really close to this December solstice, or the winter solstice here, where the northern hemisphere tilts away from the sun, and it would be the opposite of what's depicted here. This is in the northern summer, this is in the southern winter, and this depicts the December solstice is when we're the opposite, when we're sort of facing away from the sun and having our shortest days and our coldest days. But throughout that time period, the equator has direct radiation. The equator or near the equator has direct radiation for, and fairly constant time periods every day. So, right around 12 hours of pretty direct radiation throughout the day. Whereas, of course, when we're talking about the June solstice here in Canada, we have very long days, much longer than that 12 hours that you might get at the equator. Okay, so, but because of the angle of the sun, there's a lot more energy. The angle of the sun and the fact that the equator never really totally tilts away from the sun, it gets much more consistent and direct and stronger radiation. So there's a lot more energy in the system in those southerly locations. And this tropical heating leads to something we refer to as atmospheric circulation. So at the equator, we have all of this energy coming in pretty much perpendicular to the Earth's surface. It heats up that Earth's surface. You have a very warm surface. And what do we know about warm air? Well, it rises. Okay, so you have warm air that moves up, and then cool air that kind of rushes in to replace that cool, dry air, I should say. And this is a really simplistic view of that, but we have what we have that sets up around the equator is that warm, moist air rises up. It forms this big bank of clouds around the equator that because of that warm, moist air cooling down and that the moisture that's in the air has to condense and form these clouds, which then produce a huge amount of precipitation at the equator. Those warm air, that warm air comes up until it reaches the top of the troposphere, which is here about 17 kilometers, and then it cycles around, comes back down. Here it's very dry, cool air coming down, and so we have this area of high pressure. We'll get into that in the next slide. And then that dry air moves across the land and picks up water as it's moving across the land until it reaches the equator, where it's heated up sufficiently that it goes back up. And so you end up with these circulation cells, these areas of uprising and these areas of subsidence. And the areas of subsidence occur at 30 degrees north and south. So this is atmospheric circulation. I'm now going to move to my whiteboard just behind me and walk you through that process. Hi everyone. We're now over at my whiteboard in my office area, or my basement area, I should say. And what I'm going to walk you through is these atmospheric circulation cells that we just saw on the previous slide. So to kick this off, we need to draw the planet. Okay, so here's the Earth. Here at the middle we have 0 degrees, or the equator, and at 30 degrees north and south we have the tropics. 30 degrees north, 30 degrees south, we have the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn. At 60 north we have the Arctic Circle, and 60 south. And then we have 90 degrees south, which is Antarctica, and 90 degrees north, which is the Arctic. Okay, so this is our planet. I'm going to shift over to this side to then draw the circulation cells. So at the equator, the temperature is very warm. So we have very hot air at the equator. And as we saw in the previous slide, a really key component of what drives these atmospheric circulation cells is the fact that hot air rises. Okay, so at the equator, we have air that is rising up. Okay, so this is hot air that's rising up from the surface of the Earth. And as it rises up, it cools off. And we know that when hot air cools off, the water in that hot air condenses. And so at the equator, we end up with this band of clouds and a lot of precipitation happening as that hot, moist air moves upward toward the top of the troposphere, or the tropopause. That's at about 17 kilometers at the equator. And then when it reaches that tropopause, the top of the troposphere, it moves over this way to the north and to the south. That cold, now very dry air then drops down here at 30 degrees in both the north and in the south. And then that air rushes back along here to fill in the space where hot air is moving up away from the surface. Okay, so same thing here. We have air sort of moving in toward the equator, filling up this space where hot air is rising up away from the equator. Okay, and you can think about this like a pot boiling too. So you can imagine if you have a pot on your stove and you've got a flame under the pot, what happens is that that water at the bottom of the pot gets hot and moves upward, okay? And then when it reaches the surface, it's cooled off and it comes along here, drops back down and cycles back around. So you have these same convective cells set up in a pot of boiling water. Okay, so where you have cycles, water heating up, rising up, dropping down, and then cycling back around. Okay, so the same kinds of processes. If you tilted this onto its side, you can think of this as like a pot of boiling water. Your air vapor, your warm air moving up, leaving water behind, drying off. You have cool, dry air cycling around, dropping back down to the earth and filling in the place where this warm air rises up to the surface. Now these cells are referred to as Hadley cells. Okay, so we have two Hadley cells right at the equator. Now, the same thing is happening. So as this air is coming back down toward the surface, we also have air coming down here and moving along the surface this way, rising up here. So this is actually driven by the fact that up in the Arctic, we have very, very cold air dropping down to the surface, cycling along here toward 60 degrees north and rising up again at 60 degrees north and then cycling back around. So this is a polar cell. Again, down here we have in the South Pole, we have air dropping back down, moving in here, rising up at 60 degrees south, and cycling back around to do the same thing again. So we have another polar cell. And then the feral cell basically follows those. You've got warm air rising up here at 60 degrees north, cool air dropping down here at 30 degrees north. This cool air rushes along here to replace the warm air that's rising up because of the polar vortex, or the polar cell, and then comes back over here to replace. Okay, and this is called a feral cell. And so we have the same thing happening here. So air coming down with the Hadley cell, air going up with the polar cell. This air that goes up comes along here and forms the air that pushes down at 30 degrees south and comes along here. So we have three types of atmospheric circulation cells. We have our polar cells, we have our feral cells, and we have our Hadley cells. Okay, and all of this is being driven by the fact that warm air rises, cool air drops back down to the surface, and you form these circulation cells, okay? Now, because of these Hadley cells, taking warm, moist air up away from the equator, and that warm air loses its moisture, forms clouds, those clouds rain, you end up with this region, first of all, being an area of low pressure. So when we think about low pressure, we're talking about, about 800 megabars if we're talking, and also these are areas that tend to be associated with storms and precipitation. If we're talking about an area of high pressure, this is an area that maybe has about 1030 megabars, so this is just a measure of pressure and tends to be associated with clear skies and dry conditions, okay? So where we have air rising up from the surface of the earth, those clouds condensing because moisture is being lost as that warm air cools off, these are places where we have low pressure. So here at 0 degrees at the equator, and up here at 60 degrees north and 60 degrees south. These are our low pressure bands. Air is moving up away from the Earth's surface, and we end up with so putting less pressure on the Earth than where it's coming down here toward the Earth's surface, and we have these cool, dry air, this cool, dry air coming back down toward the surface, leading to these high pressure conditions. Okay, so we've got high pressure conditions at 30 degrees north and south, and also here at the poles, both the South Pole and the North Pole, where that very cold, dry air cycles back down. Okay, so we have high pressure up here, high pressure up here. And so we have these alternating patterns, bands of high and low pressure that are set up as a consequence of these atmospheric circulation cells. And so when we think about patterns of vegetation, these zones of high and low pressure are really, really important because these are the places where we have areas of high precipitation, so areas with low pressure that have typically have low pressure so areas at 60 degrees north and south and at the equator. These are places where we have a lot more precipitation. Areas of high pressure are places where we tend to more frequently have dry, clear conditions, okay? So this corresponds with moisture available for plant productivity and growth. So when we think about, we're in our next section, we're going to be talking about the distribution of different biomes. You think about the tropics here. You have a lot of water being dumped. You have warm conditions. These are conditions that are really amenable to high above ground productivity. So we end up with some of the biggest and most productive forests in the world, tropical forests. In contrast, as you move up toward these areas of high pressure where we have our Hadley cells and our Ferrel cells coming back down with dry, cool air, we end up with places that have much lower precipitation, and these are where our bands of deserts are concentrated for the most part around the globe. So we have really close correspondence between these different atmospheric circulation cells and these corresponding zones of high and low pressure. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to the Coriolis effect. We'll talk through that in the lecture or with PowerPoint slides, and then we'll return to the whiteboard in a minute. Okay, so as we just learned, there are 3 sets of convective cells that are all driven by the general rule that warm air rises. Okay. So what those convective cells do, and we talked about this, we have different zones of precipitation that get set up in response to those atmospheric cells. And so at the equator we have this low pressure zone, which is abundant precipitation in all seasons. Where those Hadley cells come down, we have high pressure cells. These are dry in all seasons, this is where we have these bands of desert to the north of the tropical zones. And then as that air moves across and starts to pick up moisture, you have places that are seasonally dry forests. Okay, now up in the poles, of course, we have high pressure. We have very limited precipitation. And it's very cold, and so this is where we end up with these polar environments, where that air rises up, and where the air from these Ferrel cells rise up, we have an area of low pressure. So this is ample precipitation again in all seasons because a lot of moisture is lost as that moist air rises up into the troposphere. Again, this is an area of low pressure, ample precipitation in all seasons. This is our temperate zone. And then between the temperate zone and these really dry regions to the north of the Hadley cells, we have places that are wet in the winter, dry in the summer. So again, these seasonally dry areas, analogous to these tropical dry forests. Okay, so we set up these kind of bands of climate across the planet in response to these atmospheric convective cells. Okay, so next we're going to be talking about the Coriolis effect, and this links in with all of this stuff we've just been talking about with atmospheric circulation cells and atmospheric circulation cells, and zones of high and low pressure. So I'm going to go back to the whiteboard and walk you through. Okay, so we're back to the whiteboard to talk about how all of this, I'm going to shift over to this side so you can see all of this detail, how all of this corresponds to the Coriolis effect and surface winds. Okay, so when we think about surface winds, the first thing to remember is that air, well, we've already talked about this, air likes to move, or air moves from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. Okay, so if you're thinking about movement of air, movement of wind on the surface of the planet, you're going to have air moving from high pressure to low pressure, from high pressure to low pressure, from high pressure to low pressure. So the directionality of that wind movement varies depending on which of these bands you are in. Okay. But the other thing is the Earth is not static. The Earth is turning constantly. And so we know that the Earth turns in this direction, because if you imagine this is us, let's say this is us right about here, the sun sets in the east, or the sun rises in the east, and so the Earth has to be turning in this direction for the sun to be rising in the east and setting in the west. So we've got the Earth turning in this direction. What that means is that when you have wind moving from this area of high pressure to this area of low pressure, but the whole Earth is turning, it means that all of the winds that are moving from one band of, from one zone to another in the northern hemisphere are turning to the right, and in the southern hemisphere, they are turning to the left. So things do different things, air moves differently in the northern and the southern hemisphere because of where they're positioned. Okay, so if we think about wind moving from here to here to the right, it curves in this way. So basically air is displaced as it moves from this area of high pressure to this area of low pressure as the Earth turns in this direction, okay? And the same thing when we think about, and so in the southern hemisphere, everything shifts to the left in response to the Coriolis effect. Okay, so what we end up with here is what we refer to as the intertropical convergence zone. This is where these winds, these trade winds, are coming together and converging on the equator during the spring and fall equinox. But as we know, the Earth tilts in response to, as it moves, the Earth is tilted at 23.5 degrees. So as it moves around the sun, the part of the Earth that is exposed to the greatest solar radiation changes through the year. And so at the spring and fall equinox, the equator gets the most energy. And so the intertropical convergence zone, that band of clouds that we talked about being created by the Hadley cells, but also where these winds converge, is right about at the equator. In the boreal summer, it'll be shifted to the north. In the southern summer, it'll be shifted to the south. And so that band of clouds, that intertropical convergence zone, shifts northward and southward as the Earth turns and as the location that receives the most energy, and so is the warmest part of the planet during the year, shifts in response to that. Okay. So we've set up these winds, but we also have winds moving from this area of high pressure to this area of low pressure. And again, these winds curve to the right in response to the turning Earth. So we've got this going on. And the same thing happens here in the south. Everything shifts to the left. Okay. And so this place where we've got kind of winds moving away from one another is a zone that is sometimes referred to as the horse latitudes. So these are areas of really, for portions of the year, fairly little wind, and they were referred to as the horse latitudes, because sailors who would get stuck in these low wind areas sometimes would have to toss the horses overboard to try to lighten their load and be able to get their sail boats moving, their ships, their wind-powered ships moving. Okay, and then finally we have areas of high pressure, an area of high pressure up here, an area of low pressure here. And so again, we have air moving from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So again, we have this sort of convergence of warm, sort of more humid tropical winds and cold Arctic winds. Same thing down here. Okay, but down in the southern hemisphere and along here. And so this is an explanation for some of the variation we see when we hear about the polar vortex, for example. It has to do exactly with this, because we have the polar air mass, or the polar vortex, moving along here, and where you have these troughs. These are places where you have cold Arctic air dominating the signal when the trough is down like this, or when you have a mound like this, you have warmer, more humid air moving up to higher latitudes compared to some of these ridges compared to these troughs over here. Okay, so that kind of explains that variation that we see through the winter here in Canada. This variation between cold Arctic air coming down in those troughs, and warm tropical, more humid air moving up in those ridges. And so that explains that variation. And sometimes when there's a really big trough or a really big ridge, that's when we end up with these really unusually cold or unusually warm weather events that we hear so much about in the news. Okay, so those are the how these circulation cells impact wind movement on the planet. And next we're going to link these patterns of wind movement to ocean currents. So we're going to move on to that now. Okay, so as we just learned, we have this Coriolis effect. It moves, so we have winds that move from areas of high pressure to low pressure, but because of the way the Earth is turning, this leads to a displacement of those winds to the left in the to the right in the northern hemisphere and to the left in the southern hemisphere. Okay, and we just walked through that, and what I want to re-highlight, which we already saw in my sketch, is the fact that this Coriolis effect drives these areas of convergence and divergence of winds. And so we have these trade winds, and we have the easterlies and the westerlies that converge and result in that variation in conjunction with the polar vortex, and these areas of very cold and very warm temperatures, where you have warm air coming in, cool air coming down, and that's dictated by the positioning of the polar vortex. Okay, so we now learned that we have these circulation cells, these atmospheric circulation cells, that are set up by the rising of warm air and the cycling of that air in the troposphere. And we have three sets of these convective cells. These convective cells, in conjunction with the fact that the planet is turning constantly, drive patterns of wind on the Earth's surface. And the other thing to note is that this changes as a function of seasons. And so we can see that in July, so this is in the northern, or if we think about, so in July, we have in the northern hemisphere the summer, The land surface is going to be warmer than the adjacent ocean surface. And so we end up with areas of low pressure over the land and areas of high pressure over the water. This changes the movement of the winds to some extent between July and January, where we have the opposite. The waters are warmer, the lands are colder, and as a consequence, we tend to have these zones of high pressure over land. So you can see this big zone of high pressure over Eurasia, this big zone of high pressure over North America, and low pressure over the oceans. So because we have movement of winds from high pressure zones to low pressure zones, this flipping of high pressure and low pressure zones between land and water seasonally modifies how those kind of idealized winds that I showed you in the previous slide will interact with land and water interfaces. Okay. Now another piece that I want to highlight is the importance of winds in driving ocean currents. Okay, so again, you imagine these winds coming from north, or coming from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. If this is in the northern hemisphere, let's say, you've got air moving from an area of high pressure to low pressure, and that Coriolis effect curves it out away from this land-water interface. And what that does is it pushes water from here out to here. So you've got the warm surface waters being kind of pushed offshore by these winds. And what happens is that these cooler, deeper, nutrient-laden waters at depths rise up and replace that warm, nutrient-depleted water. And so this is a way of cycling nutrients in the ocean that's driven by wind patterns, and is really critical for dictating productivity of these oceans. Okay, and so I'm going to show you the correspondence between this Coriolis effect and global patterns of upwelling. And so this is a map. So we have Australia here, we have South America here, here's Africa, and these different colors correspond to ocean temperatures. And so what we can see from this is these patterns of upwelling that happen. So you've got, if we think, so here we have South America, here we have South America. We've got these winds that move across here, across the surface of that land, and push that water off that coastal water away from the shore. And so what happens is we have much cooler water. So this is a major zone of upwelling here by South America. We have these much cooler waters. They're about 22, 24 degrees. These much cooler waters coming up here to the surface, and then the warm waters that were here on the coast are pushed over and kind of pile up here along Australia and New Zealand, Australia and Papua New Guinea, and so we end up with this area that has very, very warm waters here, and this major area of upwelling here. And so you can see how that Coriolis effect and how those winds moving across this continent and pushing out into the ocean can impact the productivity. So this is a very productive zone here off the coast of South America. And then we can look at things in terms of productivity. And so the configuration of this map is a bit different, but again, you can see this band. So the green areas on this, so this map is showing us chlorophyll concentrations in milligrams per meters cubed, I should say. And so blue is a low value of chlorophyll, green is a high value of chlorophyll. And what we can see is that right through this area, this sort of intertropical convergence zone where you've got these winds moving water leading to zones of upwelling, this leads to productive areas that then extend out across extend out from those zones of upwelling. So we end up with, for example, over here in Australia and Papua New Guinea, where that warm water really piled up that we saw in that last figure, we have areas of very low productivity compared to off the coast of South America, off the coast of Africa, where the winds are pushing the waters offshore and leading to areas of upwelling. Okay, so the next piece about ocean currents that I want to talk about is the Great Ocean Conveyor. And this is kind of, we just talked about upwelling. This includes upwelling at a very large scale, at kind of the scale of the entire planet, and is a critical component of heat transfer from the tropics to polar regions. And it's also a critical component of recharging nutrients and carbon dioxide. So again, like upwelling that we saw in those sort of offshore examples, this upwelling that occurs as a function of the thermohaline current that is that moves ocean water around the entire planet. We have areas where we've got cold water rising up, cold nutrient-rich water rising up to the surface and replenishing those areas, creating zones of enhanced productivity. Okay, so how does this work? Well, the basic mechanism that drives this ocean conveyor belt, this thermohaline current, is temperature and salinity. And so if we think about it, so the place that it starts is up here in the North Atlantic. Okay, so you've got water that's come up from the Gulf, via the Gulf Stream to the North Atlantic, and that water is warm and is much more buoyant because it's warm and it has less salt compared to the water that is in the North Atlantic. But as that warm water freezes, the salt stays in the water is removed from it, so the water becomes saltier and colder, and as a consequence denser, and it drops down. And so you have this current, this water that drops down deep into the ocean, moves down here, moves along Antarctica, picks up, it's really recharged as it moves through those deep cold areas of the ocean. It picks up lots of nutrients, and we have this deep current that moves along and splits here, goes up to the Indian Ocean, and over here goes up to the Pacific. Okay, and as it moves from these cold southerly latitudes to warm, more equatorial latitudes, though the water also warms up and starts to rise up to the surface. So it brings this cold, recharged water up to the surface in these two major ocean basins. And then that warm water continues to get warmer and cycles back along here. And this is going to be very familiar to you, moves up here, picks up, continues to travel along, and this is the Gulf Stream. And that Gulf Stream then meets with water coming down from, meets with the Labrador Current coming down here, and is pushed over to the North Atlantic. Okay, and because it moves over to the North Atlantic, we have these major climatic differences between Northern Europe, Northwestern Europe, and North America. And we'll see that a couple of slides from now, but at the comparable latitudes, the climate in this part of Europe is much, much, much warmer and more temperate than the climate over here in comparable parts of North America. So these ocean currents really play a really major role in global climate patterns. Okay, so that is the ocean conveyor. So starts up here in the North Atlantic, where water freezes and that dense salty water drops down, and then it cycles around the planet. It takes about 1,000 years for water to make to cycle the whole system. And so it's a very slow process, but the ocean is in constant motion. Now, to bring this back to climate change, climate warming, there's a lot of concern about this, this really important ocean current. And the reason for that is that these massive glaciers in Greenland are releasing a lot of fresh water. So warming is driving really rapid melting of glaciers throughout the world. Pretty much every glacier on the planet is decreasing in size, but there are some really important ones. The glaciers on Greenland, the ice sheets on Greenland, the ice sheet on Greenland being one of those really major frozen sources of fresh water. Antarctica is another one. And when we have those major massive bodies of fresh water that are frozen and they start to melt, that releases a lot of fresh water into the ocean. And that contributes to sea level rise, of course, but importantly in the context of this current, if we go back a tick here, fresh water is coming in here, just where the mechanism that drives this ocean current results in fresh water being taken out, and this is why those salty waters, those denser waters drop down, is because that fresh water has been taken out and there's more salt. If you add fresh water to the mix, what it does is it slows down this current. When this current slows down, it backs water up on the eastern part of North America. And this is why we're seeing such rapid sea level rise in that area. Lots of parts of that region seeing really regular flooding as a consequence of the Gulf Stream slowing down because of fresh water being released from melting ice sheet, the melting Greenland ice sheet. Okay, so for those of you interested in reading more about this, there's a couple of really great plain language articles here from Environment 360 that's produced by Yale University. And definitely worth taking a look at those. One that focuses more on this mechanism that could slow down the thermohaline circulation in the oceans. And the second talking more about how that impacts sea level along the eastern seaboard of the United States. Okay, so global temperatures. We're back to this picture. We saw this before. So we've already talked about the fact that global temperatures are really driven importantly by solar radiation. Okay, so much more intense direct radiation that's consistent year-round at the poles, at the equator compared to the poles. And so we have this broad latitudinal gradient, but there's other factors that come into play. And we just talked about one of these, ocean currents. So here in this picture, you see, here's Scandinavia, here's the United Kingdom. These are at comparable latitudes to, very high latitude areas of North America, the Northwest Territories, the Hudson Bay lowlands. These are places that are underlain by permafrost here in Canada that have very cold subarctic climates. But over there in Europe, you've got, the UK being, temperate rainforest environments. Scandinavia is broadleaf, deciduous, dominated in much of it. You do get into, it's obviously a boreal environment there as well, but almost no permafrost, only up at the very, very tip of Scandinavia. And this is all driven by that warm, you can see how warm it is over here, driven by that warm Gulf Stream that moves over here away from the eastern coast of Canada and toward Europe. So these ocean currents are really, really critical. And likewise, over here, the cold Humboldt current keeps the west coast of South America cooler than expected. That's that upwelling that we saw a few slides. Okay, so in addition to these ocean currents and the general radiation patterns, mountains play a really important role in determining temperature. So higher elevations tend to have much cooler temperatures than similar latitude, than lower elevation places at similar latitudes. And there's a couple of reasons for that. At higher elevations, there's fewer air molecules to absorb radiation, and so less heat transfer to the ground, to the Earth's surface. So heating is less effective at those higher altitudes. And second, exchange of energy, so convective exchange of energy is more effective at higher altitudes where where winds can kind of blow more freely. You have your sort of surface roughness is less, so you have better energy exchange at those high altitudes compared to lower altitudes. So we see these broad general patterns of warmer at the equator, colder at the poles, but that these are impacted by ocean currents and topography quite substantially. Okay, and then we can think about temperature variation as well. This is really important. So this graph is showing us not actual temperatures, but actually the annual variation in temperature. And so we can see the highest values occur in these really continental portions of Siberia, of North America, where we have from across the year variation in temperature of 55, 60 degrees Celsius. This is tremendous variation compared to the equator, where we have, somewhere between 0 and 3 degrees variation in temperature. So we go from a very benign environment at the equator to a very harsh, extreme environment as you move toward the poles, particularly in continental areas toward the poles. So proximity of, so part of this is determined by the tilt of the Earth's axis, of course. These extremes are driven by the fact that in the boreal winter, these areas see very little sun, and it's at very steep angles. Very low angles. And so we have this tilt of the Earth's axis that drives this, and we've already talked about that seasonality, but also proximity to the ocean, so this maritime influence. And you can see this in this figure. The more when you have these large land masses, the more interior portions of these have much more extreme climate variation compared to coastal areas. So here we have only, at the same latitude, only a 25-degree variation in seasonal temperatures compared to a 60-degree variation at the same latitude. And over here in, I guess that would be the border between Alaska and the Yukon, you've got 45 degrees, again, compared to this 25 or 30-degree variation in these maritime areas. So proximity to oceans really is a really important modifying factor, and you can see this here. Here are two different locations in Siberia. One is in a very continental region, one is right over here on the coast, and you can see how different their climates are. So in Katirka, we have pretty stable temperatures, so it doesn't get nearly as warm as it does in the interior, but it also doesn't get nearly as cold. So its minimum temperatures are about minus 10 degrees Celsius, its maximum temperatures are about 10 degrees Celsius, compared to here in this continental region where you go from minus 40 to almost 20 degrees Celsius in the summer. So that's that 60-degree variation. This is owing to the fact that it takes a lot of energy to change the temperature of the ocean. And so the ocean really dampens those extremes that in temperature, and also creates conditions that tend to have more precipitation, more cloud cover, so you have less extreme conditions both during the winter and the summer. Okay, so maritime influence, we've already talked about this. So again, in places where the day lengths are very short in the winter and very long in the summer, you end up with these much bigger extremes in climate. Okay, so that's variation in temperature, and that the ability to tolerate that variation in temperature is a really important part of the distribution of organisms as well. It's hard to live in a place where you have 60 degrees Celsius variation in temperature throughout the year. And the adaptations that species have to tolerate that compared to this very benign, constant temperature, constant precipitation of the equator is a really big challenge. Okay. Global precipitation patterns. We're just circling back on these things that we said that we really wanted to know the drivers of. And so we already identified the fact that those atmospheric circulation cells, the Hadley cells, where the Hadley cells come up, where the feral and polar cells, where warm air rises from where the polar and feral cells converge, these are places where we have a lot of precipitation. And we'll see that in the next slide. Proximity to oceans. So again, we saw that and we talked about that in the last slide, but when you're closer to oceans, you tend to have again, a more maritime climate, which drives, which results in greater precipitation because of your proximity to these large water bodies. And then elevation, and we'll talk about this rain shadow effect. So not only does elevation affect temperature, but not surprisingly, as those as you lose temperature, as air loses temperature as it's moving up a mountain, what happens? The same thing as happens in those Hadley cells, in those convective cells, where air is rising, warm air is rising, and the moisture in it is condensing as the air cools. As you move up a mountain, the air cools, the water condenses, and rain drops on one side of the mountain, and then you have this dry air coming down the other side of the mountain. Okay, so our circulation cells, here we have our Hadley cells, our Ferrel cells, and our polar cells. And we have those two areas of low pressure where the polar and Ferrel cells, where those warm airs are air is rising up and precipitation, clouds are forming and precipitation is ample. Same thing here at the equator where the Hadley cells are coming up. Water is condensing, clouds are forming, precipitation happens. You end up with these lovely bands. So here is the equatorial region, this band of very high precipitation, and likewise around, throughout the temperate regions. And this varies, of course. There's different components to these patterns. The most sort of the clearest example of how these circulation cells impact precipitation is in Africa, in the continent of Africa, where we have, at the equator, we have the highest precipitation, and then you move into these seasonally dry tropical forests, and this is right at about 30 degrees latitude, and we have the Saharan desert. And so this is sort of the idealized outcome of these circulation cells. In other places, it's a little more complicated. We look over here in North America. Yeah, we certainly have these wet regions at about the latitude we'd expect, this low pressure area where the Ferrel and the polar cells diverge from one another. But there are portions of that don't have very high precipitation. And part of that is driven by continentality, and we can see that over here in kind of the grain belt, the wheat belt of the United States and into Canada, but also these areas of very low precipitation, which are in the rain shadow of the Cascade Mountains, the various mountain ranges that follow the western coast of North America. Okay. So rain shadows and lapse rates. We already talked about lapse rate. This is the cooling of air as you move up mountainside. So if you imagine, let's imagine this is the west coast of the United States or of Canada, and we think about those lush temperate rainforests that occupy, the western coast of British Columbia and down into Washington and Oregon. These are really incredible forests that have some of the highest biomass on the planet because there's so much precipitation there. That huge amount of precipitation is driven by this rain shadow effect. And so you have winds coming in off of the Pacific Ocean, so very wet air, water-laden air coming in across the ocean and then going up the mountainside. And as it goes up, it cools off. All of that moisture condenses, and you end up with these environments that have a tremendous amount of rainfall. And then that wind, that air current, reaches the peak, drops back down, and as it drops down, the air warms up, of course, but there's very little moisture left in it. And as that air warms up and expands, there's even it becomes drier and drier, and you end up with this rain shadow effect where you have deserts on the leeward side of the mountain, and you have these lush forests on the windward side of the mountain. Okay, so that's the rain shadow effect and lapse rate. And what this can look like is this sort of thing. So on the west coast, on the west facing slope in, let's say, in North America, we have these, these forests that have lots of cloud cover, lots of precipitation, support really lush vegetation. And then on the leeward side, on the east facing slope, desert conditions. And it looks like this. Here you have, your forested portion of the mountain range, and here you have your deserts. And so really, really distinct physiographic forms in relation to these rain shadows. Okay, and then finally we have seasonality and precipitation. So this, of course, we have some seasonality and precipitation in lots of places on the planet. But in the tropics, where there's very little seasonality in temperature, seasonality and precipitation is really the key player when it comes to kind of any kind of phenological response. So we think of our seasons where our trees drop the leaves, and then in the fall, and then go dormant during the winter, and in the spring they produce new foliage. Similar things happen in tropical areas where there's seasonality and precipitation, but this has more to do with that precipitation. So in the dry season, some proportion of the forest will drop their leaves, and in the wet season, everything kind of comes alive again. And so this happens in these areas that are close to, so here we have 23.5 degrees north, 23.5 degrees south, the equator. And so if you recall, during the spring and the autumn equinox, the equator is just about the warmest place on the planet, or is the warmest place on the planet. It's the portion of the planet that's receiving the most direct radiation, and so is the warmest. And so that band of clouds, that intertropical convergence zone, is really like squarely located pretty much over top of the equator. So right about there. And so you'll have, the warmest temperatures, the greatest precipitation happening right around the equator. But as the Earth tilts, as the Earth tilts toward the winter solstice, we have the boreal winter. When the Earth tilts, when the Earth is in the summer solstice, we have the boreal summer. And so depending on, in the winter solstice, December 21st, there's a lot more, the portion of the planet that's getting the highest amount of radiation is right down here around 23.5 degrees south. And so that intertropical convergence zone shifts downwards. So you have the most precipitation happening down in this portion, even more so than the equator at that time of year. So you have this peak in precipitation happening in the winter months in the southern, down sort of to further south than the equator. Same thing in the boreal summer. So over here in the summer solstice, the June solstice, you have more precipitation falling up here, so that intertropical convergence zone has shifted back northward, and is hovering a little bit north of the equator, and so you get more precipitation up here, and so you get this seasonality and precipitation in these seasonally dry tropical forests at that time of the year. At those times of the year. And it's for that reason, because of the tilt of the Earth and which portion around the equator is getting the most energy, and so where that intertropical convergence zone, where that band of clouds is really sitting. Okay, the last thing I want to cover today has to do with feedbacks between the Earth's surface and the atmosphere. So we saw this in an earlier presentation, or in an earlier slide in this presentation, and the things I want to focus on are these pieces of sensible heat and latent heat, so evapotranspirative fluxes. These are the components of the Earth's energy balance that are impacted by vegetation, and so we'll just take a little look at what happens under different vegetation conditions. And this links to those components of habitat loss, habitat degradation that we talked about as being an important component of our understanding. We've already talked about the impact of climate change, so greenhouse gas emissions, and how that impacts climate change through this back radiation process. But when we change the characteristics of the surface of the land, that also alters the radiation budget. Oh dear. And so when we think about a forested environment, so let's imagine this lovely boreal forest here compared to a grassland. So let's say this forest was cleared and used for some other purpose. We have very, very different radiation budgets. Okay, so in the case of this forested environment, you have a much darker surface. So when you have a darker surface, less energy is reflected from that surface, so more energy is absorbed. So you can see that our arrow for albedo, the reflectivity or the energy reflected from the surface, is much larger for this kind of deforested area compared to this forested area. Okay, so less energy being reflected from the surface, more energy being absorbed. Also, the sensible heat loss from this environment is lower than the sensible heat loss from this, because this surface is a rougher surface. It has more vegetation, it has more structure. It means that wind can't interact with that surface as well, and less heat is lost to those convective processes, compared to this very open area where wind can move very, very freely through it, is less constrained by this roughness of the vegetation, and as a consequence, energy exchange happens much more readily. But the biggest difference here is this latent heat loss, so the evapotranspirative flux. Of course, our evapotranspirative flux from a forested surface where you have trees actively taking up moisture and releasing it to the atmosphere via transpiration is much larger from a forested system than from this deforested system. And the balance between these leads to a system that is, when you have forested environments, the land surface is cooled much more effectively than if you have deforested environments. Despite the fact that the albedo is lower, the sensible heat loss is lower, but this is compensated and much more by the cooling, the evapotranspirative cooling that happens. And so you can I'm sure you've experienced this. If you're in a city or if you're in an open field, it's much hotter than if you're inside a forest. And so we have a really important cooling function of forested surfaces compared to deforested surfaces. So as our land surfaces change on the planet because of human uses, we really can have a very major impact on the energy balance of the system. So this is my final slide in this presentation, just to remind you that land use change can alter climate. So this is just a picture of deforestation in the Amazon, where you have this lovely, dark, lush tropical forest, and deforestation butting right up against that. And you can imagine all of those things that I just talked about, where you have a lighter surface that interacts more with air currents, but a surface that has very low evapotranspirative fluxes. And so this is going to be, a cooling powerhouse from a energy budget perspective. And so that is all I have to say about the physical environment. Our next lecture is going to be on the biosphere, and we will be talking about how these physical processes affect kind of biotic organization at global scales. And with that, I will say have a great day, and I'll be talking to you guys soon.